By the spring of 1943, the Eastern Front had reached a state of exhausted equilibrium. The brilliant counter-offensive orchestrated by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein in the wake of the Stalingrad disaster, known historically as the Backhand blow or the Third Battle of Kharkov, had stabilized the southern sector of the front but left a massive bulge in the lines around the city of Kursk. This bulge, protruding over 150 kilometers into the German lines, represented both a tempting operational target and a deadly strategic trap. To the Chief of the General Staff, Kurt Zeitzler, and the Supreme Commander, Adolf Hitler, the Kursk salient appeared to be the perfect location to launch a double envelopment, codenamed Operation Citadelâ, that would trap and destroy massive Soviet forces, restore Axis prestige, and secure the strategic initiative for the remainder of the summer. However, inside the high-level planning rooms of the OKH, several of Germany's most brilliant operational minds viewed the impending offensive with a mixture of dread and profound skepticism. General Heinz Guderian, newly appointed as the Inspector General of Armoured Troops, was particularly vocal in his opposition to Operation Citadelâ. Guderian, who had pioneered the rapid, deep penetration tactics of the Blitzkrieg, recognized that the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the raw material superiority or the air cover necessary to execute a successful frontal assault against a deeply fortified salient. He argued that the newly manufactured Panther and Tiger tanks, which Hitler insisted would guarantee victory, were still plagued by severe mechanical defects, and that rushing them into combat before they were fully tested would result in a catastrophic waste of armored strength. During a tense conference in Munich on May 10, 1943, Guderian looked Hitler directly in the eye and asked why they were attacking in the east at all that year, pointing out that the German public cared little about Kursk and that throwing away their armoured reserves would leave them helpless to defend against the impending Allied invasion of Western Europe. Manstein himself, while initially favouring a rapid strike in April before the Soviets could prepare, had become increasingly pessimistic as the offensive was repeatedly postponed to allow for the delivery of more heavy tanks. He realized that the Red Army, operating under the supreme direction of Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the Stavka, had utilized this precious time to transform the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified, deeply layered defensive zone in the history of warfare. Galen's Fremde Heere Ost intelligence branch confirmed that the Soviets had constructed up to 8 defensive zones, stretching nearly 300 kilometers deep, containing over 1 million landmines, thousands of anti-tank guns, and a colossal strategic reserve force, the Steppe Front, under General Ivan Konev. In this alternative history, the combined operational weight of Manstein's cold mathematical calculations, Guderian's frantic warnings, and Galen's terrifying intelligence dossiers finally breaks through Hitler's ideological obsession with offensive action. Recognizing that a frontal assault against the Kursk redoubt is mathematically guaranteed to result in the destruction of their armored forces, the OKH undergoes a profound strategic pivot, permanently cancelling Operation Citadelâ in early June 1943. The decision to cancel Citadel represents a radical realignment of German grand strategy, transitioning the Wehrmacht from a posture of desperate offensive gamble to one of rigid, calculated strategic defense. Rather than throwing their elite panzer divisions into the Soviet anti-tank killing zones, the Germans prepare to let the Red Army launch the first blow, aiming to absorb the Soviet offensive within deep, elastic defensive lines and then destroy their overextended spearheads in highly mobile, localized counterstrikes. This pivot requires an immense administrative and psychological reorganization within the Axis High Command, as soldiers who had been trained for 2 years to believe in the absolute superiority of the offensive must now adapt to the grim, grinding realities of defensive warfare. The German military leadership knows that this strategy represents their last, desperate chance to avoid total systemic collapse, setting the stage for an unprecedented operational collision on the burning plains of southern Russia. With the cancellation of Operation Citadelâ, The German High Command immediately initiated the construction of the Elastic Shield, a massive defensive network designed to fundamentally alter the tactical landscape of the Belgorod and Orel sectors. Under the direct supervision of Field Marshal Walter Model in the north and Field Marshal Erich von Manstein in the south, the Wehrmacht set out to build a defense-in-depth system that mirrored and in some aspects surpassed the defensive preparations of the Red Army. The primary objective was to avoid a linear, fragile front line that could be easily pierced by massive Soviet armored spearheads. Instead, the Germans constructed a defensive zone stretching 40 kilometers deep behind the front line, characterized by mutually supporting anti-tank strongpoints, deep communication trenches, and extensive minefields. The core of the Elastic Shield was the tactical integration of the newly arrived Panther and Tiger tanks, not as offensive battering rams, but as mobile anti-tank pillboxes and rapid counter-attack reserves. The heavy Tiger tanks, with their thick armor and devastating 88mm guns, were positioned in deeply concealed, log-reinforced hulls, known as tank ramparts, on the high ground overlooking the most probable Soviet avenues of advance. From these elevated, fortified positions, the Tigers could engage the Soviet T-34s at extreme ranges of up to 2,000 meters, long before the Soviet tank guns could penetrate their thick frontal armor. The lighter Panzer IVs and the new Panther tanks were held in reserve, ready to launch rapid, localized counterattacks into the flanks of any Soviet formations that managed to bypass the first defensive zone. To complement this armored redoubt, the Germans constructed extensive infantry strongpoints, utilizing hundreds of the highly effective 7.5 centimeter PaK-40 anti-tank guns and 88mm flak batteries arranged in interlocking fields of fire. The front lines were saturated with hundreds of thousands of anti-tank Teller mines and anti-personnel S-mines, while deep anti-tank ditches and barbed wire entanglements were constructed along the natural defensive barriers of the terrain, such as the Siol and Donets rivers. The German infantry, reinforced with specialized anti-tank pioneer units and heavily equipped with the new Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck rocket launchers, were trained in the tactics of elastic defense, which allowed them to temporarily withdraw from their forward trenches during heavy Soviet artillery bombardments and then reoccupy their positions to repel the advancing enemy infantry. Logistically, the cancellation of Citadel allowed the Wehrmacht to accumulate massive reserves of ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts, which were securely stored in underground supply depots behind the front line. The Luftwaffe's 8th Air Corps, commanded by General Hans Zeidemann, was reorganized and repositioned to provide maximum tactical air support, with its specialized Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and HS-129 tank buster aircraft held on high-alert airfields close to the front. By the end of June 1943, the Belgorod and Orel sectors had been transformed into a formidable defensive bastion. The German and Allied soldiers, now backed by heavy weaponry and anchored by deeply layered fortifications, waited in tense silence under the grey summer skies, knowing that the strategic initiative had passed to the Red Army and that a defensive storm of unparalleled violence was about to break over their heads. On July 12, 1943, the tense silence along the Eastern Front was shattered as the Red Army, realizing that the Germans would not launch their expected offensive, unleashed their own massive summer campaign, codenamed Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Rumyantsev in the south. Under the supreme coordination of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Stavka committed over 1,500,000 men, 5,000 tanks, and 3,000 aircraft to a colossal multi-front offensive designed to crush the German armies holding the Orel and Belgorod salients. The Soviet assault began with a terrifying 4-hour artillery bombardment involving over 20,000 guns and Katyusha rocket launchers, transforming the German front lines into a burning, cratered wasteland. But as the massive waves of Soviet infantry and T-34 tanks advanced across the desolate steppe, they did not find a fragile, overextended line. Instead, they ran headlong into the deadly, deeply layered network of the elastic shield. As the leading Soviet tank brigades pushed through the smoke and dust, they were met by a devastating, coordinated wall of fire from the concealed German Tiger and Panther ramparts. The heavy 88mm shells of the Tigers tore through the leading T-34s at long ranges, causing dozens of tanks to explode in brilliant sheets of orange flame. The extensive, carefully disguised German minefields funneled the advancing Soviet armor into pre-sighted killing zones, where the interlocking fields of fire from the PaK-40 anti-tank guns and heavy artillery subjected them to a relentless, grinding barrage. Despite the catastrophic losses in armor and personnel, the sheer mass of the Soviet assault, driven by the aggressive operational directives of General Vatutin and General Rokossovsky, managed to force its way through the first defensive zone, pushing deep into the second and threatening to isolate the frontline divisions. It was at this critical juncture, around midday, that the German mobile armored reserves were unleashed. Erich von Manstein, operating with a fully rehabilitated and concentrated 3 Panzer Corps and the elite 2 SS Panzer Corps, ordered his panzers to execute a series of coordinated, pre-planned counter-strikes. Utilizing their superior tactical mobility, radio communications, and the devastating firepower of their Panther and Tiger tanks, the German panzers struck the overextended flanks of the advancing Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army and the 1st Tank Army, which had become separated from their supporting infantry and artillery in the deep, dusty valleys of the south. A fierce, chaotic tank battle erupted across the burning plains of Prokhorovka and Belgorod, as the German Tiger IVs and Panthers engaged the Soviet T-34s in a series of violent, fluid encounters. The tactical skill of the German tank crews and the superior range of their weaponry allowed them to systematically dismantle the Soviet tank brigades, inflicting catastrophic casualties on Konev's and Vatutin's forces. By the night of July 15, 1943, the grand strategic design of the Soviet summer offensive had been violently disrupted. While the Red Army had achieved minor localized breakthroughs, the primary strategic objectives of Operation Kutuzov and Operation Rumyantsev had been completely halted. The Soviet tank armies had suffered devastating casualties, with over 1,500 tanks destroyed in less than 4 days, transforming what was intended to be a swift, decisive breakthrough into a savage, localized battle of attrition that ground down the finest strategic reserves of the Stavka. While the tactical success of the elastic shield in blunting the Soviet summer offensive represented a major operational victory for the Wehrmacht, it did not provide the strategic breathing room that the German High Command so desperately required. Even as the smoke was clearing from the burning tank fields of Belgorod and Prokhorovka, a strategic crisis of monumental proportions was developing on the southern flank of the European theatre. On July 10, 1943, a massive Anglo-American invasion fleet materialized off the coast of Sicily, launching Operation Husky and opening a dangerous second front that directly threatened the Italian mainland and the deep southern underbelly of the Third Reich. The invasion of Sicily forced a dramatic and panic-induced shift in German strategic priorities. Adolf Hitler, terrified that the Italian fascist regime of Benito Mussolini would collapse and that Italy would sign a separate peace with the Allies, recognized that he could no longer focus his attention exclusively on the Eastern Front. In a series of urgent conferences at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler ordered the immediate transfer of critical motorized and armored divisions, air assets, and logistical resources from the Eastern Front to reinforce the collapsing positions in the Mediterranean. Elite divisions like the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division which had just finished fighting in the defensive battles of the Don and Kursk, were stripped of their heavy equipment, loaded onto trains, and sent on a multi-thousand-kilometer journey to Italy and the Balkans. The sudden and systematic diversion of these elite reserves represented a devastating self-inflicted blow to the Wehrmacht's defensive capabilities on the Eastern Front. While the cancellation of Operation Citadelâ and the success of the Elastic Shield had prevented the immediate collapse of Army Group South and Army Group Centre, the loss of their mobile armoured reserves deprived Manstein and Model of the operational flexibility required to maintain their defensive lines. The Wehrmacht found itself in a state of terrifying vulnerability, operating along an incredibly long, fragile front line with no strategic reserves to counter the secondary, devastating offensives that the Soviet Stavka was preparing to launch across the entire width of the Eastern Front. The battle along the Eastern Front during the late summer and autumn of 1943 transformed into a desperate slow-motion retreat, as the German forces, starved of fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts, were gradually pushed back toward the Dnieper River. The Soviet Western and Southwestern fronts, operating with a relentless and efficient coordination under Marshal Zhukov, capitalized on this strategic drain by launching a series of secondary offensives that targeted the deep German flanks and logistical centers. The Wehrmacht, locked in a rigid, static defensive battle of its own making, was unable to respond to these global threats, demonstrating that in the clash of industrial giants, the Eastern Front could not be evaluated in isolation from the broader, global dimensions of the conflict that was rapidly closing in on the Third Reich. When we evaluate the alternative scenario of the Kursk defensive through the lens of strategic wargaming and economic analysis, we are confronted with the cold, unyielding reality that no tactical brilliance or defensive preparation could alter the fundamental strategic balance of the Second World War. The prevention of the immediate destruction of the German panzer forces at Kursk, while represented as a major tactical victory in German operational memoirs, was ultimately a temporary delay in a process of systemic defeat that was dictated by the unbridgeable chasm in industrial production and demographic mobilization between the Axis powers and the Grand Alliance. In 1943, the gross domestic product of the Allied powers exceeded the economic capacity of Germany and its occupied territories by a ratio of more than 5-1. This economic disparity translated directly into a crushing material superiority on the battlefield that the Wehrmacht simply could not counter with tactical maneuver or static defense. The primary failure of the alternative German defensive strategy lay in the miscalculation of Soviet mobilization capacity. While the Elastic Shield succeeded in inflicting massive, localized casualties on the Soviet tank armies, the Soviet state was able to mobilize and train over 1,200,000 new soldiers during the summer of 1943 alone, forming dozens of fresh divisions that were immediately deployed to the front. The Soviet factories in the Urals continued to deliver a steady, uninterrupted flow of new T-34 tanks, heavy artillery, and ammunition directly to the frontline railheads, completely replacing their catastrophic losses in a matter of weeks. Conversely, the German war economy, operating under the chaotic and uncoordinated direction of Albert Speer and the Ministry of Armaments, was already facing severe shortages of skilled labor, coal, steel, and critical raw materials. The loss of a single German tank commander or experienced non-commissioned officer represented an irreplaceable strategic defeat, whereas the Red Army could absorb immense losses and continue to execute large-scale, multi-front operations. The escalation of the Allied strategic bombing campaign against the industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley further disrupted German aircraft and tank production, forcing the Reich to allocate significant resources to the air defense of the homeland. In the final analysis, the historical ledger of the Second World War demonstrates that the German Empire was defeated not by a single tactical error, a premature winter, or a flawed operational plan, but by the relentless grinding mathematics of a total industrialized global war. The cancellation of Operation Citadel and the construction of the elastic shield would have saved the Wehrmacht's armoured forces from the immediate humiliation of the Kursk salient, but it would have done so only by consuming the very forces that were required to defend the rest of the overextended German Empire. It would have transformed the Eastern Front from a series of sudden, dramatic operational catastrophes into a prolonged, slow-motion disaster that would have bled the Wehrmacht dry across the entire length of the front, proving that in the clash of industrial giants there was no defensive compromise that could overcome the absolute supremacy of mass production and mobilized manpower.